heading away.
Rainbow Six Extraction released roughly 3 years ago on January 20th, 2022 as an attempt to capitalize on their existing live service cash cow, Rainbow Six Siege. However, due to lackluster marketing, broken promises, and large amounts of recycled content, most players outside of a niche small audience forgot about it. And immediately after its release, the game would fall into obscurity, quickly becoming one of Ubisoft's biggest failures in the company's history. With these facts in mind, I wanted to go back and take a look at the game to find out why it failed, whether it's worth playing today, and how the game got to where it is now. I'll be breaking down the video into individual parts for your viewing experience, so feel free to skip to the parts you are most interested in. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. Now, before we can talk about Rainbow Six Extraction's strengths and weaknesses, I think we must first discuss the game's development, to better put it all into context. If you have played Rainbow Six Siege before, then you will likely know how this story goes. But if you haven't, then this story is important because it will help you understand why a lot of people look down on this title. The game's development started somewhere between the 2016 and 2017 timeframe, as a limited time mode for Rainbow Six Siege, which was a live service competitive tactical shooter that Ubisoft had been adding content to for the past 3 years. The reason for this is because Ubisoft Montreal wanted to focus more of their energy on new modes to Siege instead of maps or operators. They likely made this decision to incentivize people to come back to the game that had quit previously, and to obviously make money off the incredibly expensive cosmetics that came along with them. This was their first attempt at that philosophy, and it was quite successful. The mode would be released to R6 in the Year 3 Season 1 content update on March 6th, 2018, also called Operation Chimera, and the event would be released under the title Outbreak. As you can likely tell by its name, this event was entirely based on the idea of an infestation spreading around the world, and the operators from Siege were tasked with fighting that global pandemic. However, this wasn't your typical zombie outbreak. The pandemic our operators were fighting was actually an alien invasion of creatures called the Archaens. The reason this is important is because this story element allowed for Ubisoft to create many different variants of Archaens to mix up gameplay out of just the typical zombie enemy you'd see in normal game. Now, the way the mode was originally designed was a linear, mission-based mode. Each mission would have 2 objectives that the 3 players must complete, which, yes, this mode was limited to 3-player co-op instead of the usual 5-player limit players had expected throughout the rest of Siege. The huge focus on objectives in this mode helped to separate it from other zombie or alien shooters on the market around this time, and it made it feel like it belonged in the Tom Clancy universe and also inside of the Siege game. You can definitely see how Outbreak laid the foundation for Extraction as well, because a lot of the game's objectives, mechanics, and Archaean types were present in this mode nearly 4 years prior to Extraction's release. Now, this event, due to the sheer content present, was praised by everyone around this time, and the event's success alone drew a lot of new players to Rainbow Six Siege, and it also likely made Ubisoft a ton of money due to the event being packed to the brim with cosmetic loot boxes, as I mentioned earlier. So due to all of these incentives, this showed Ubisoft that events were a successful idea for Siege, and that the Chimera game mode had some real potential with some more added content. So the decision was made once Outbreak wrapped up at the end of Operation Chimera to continue adding on to the event to hopefully turn it into its own full-fledged game. This is why, if you played Siege around this time, the game's seasonal content updates started to get less and less content inside of them. Ubisoft Montreal was being split between these 2 projects, and likely many others, with the hope of drawing more players to the series that otherwise wouldn't have touched it, so they didn't have as much resources to put towards Siege. At least that is the most likely and popular rumor going around, because Ubisoft has never been the most well-known company for their communication. So we still don't know for sure why Siege's new content started to ramp down, but that is the most likely explanation. So as part of the studio was working on new content for Year 4 and Year 5 of Siege, the rest were working on development of R6 Extraction to hopefully get it off the ground as quickly as possible. They would end up being pretty successful at this goal, because during E3 of 2019, Ubisoft would announce the game publicly for the first time under the name Rainbow Six Quarantine. This occurred just 1 year after the release of Outbreak, and the game was set to release in 2020 according to the trailer. However, due to the medical situation going on at this time that I can't name, development on the game slowed significantly. Also, due to this global medical situation, Ubisoft decided to switch the game's name to Extraction to disassociate from the situation. And due to these complications and the obvious problems that come with renaming a game after already announcing it, Ubisoft would make the decision to delay the game by 2 years to January 2022. And they would keep working hard to make sure the game was polished, well programmed, and full of content. They would eventually get the game ready for the public in early 2022, and a closed technical test would be held between November 5th and November 7th, 2021. This test was mainly to ensure the balance of the game and to make sure that the game was technically sound before the public got their hands on it. And once they quickly cleaned everything up that was found in the test, the game would be on its way to release. And trust me, that delay turned out to be an amazing thing for Ubisoft, because immediately after the game's release, Ubisoft would start receiving some backlash. Rainbow Six Extraction will release on January 20th, 2022 on all platforms, including Game Pass. And immediately upon release, the game would woefully underperform. If you look at the Steam charts, which isn't exactly representative of player counts on all platforms, but it is a useful metric to analyze, the game only released with a little over 2,000 players on that platform. And from what I can see in the reviews, the game saw most of its players through Game Pass and PS Plus. The reason for this is likely due to a lot of players feeling it was too much of a risky purchase, since it was something that they had already experienced in a previous event for free. It was a Ubisoft title, which they didn't have the best track record at the time, and since at the time it cost a whopping $40. Despite most of the players being on a different platform, it is worth noting the huge drop in the game's player count on Steam just a few months after launch. This is likely the case on other platforms too, since stats like this are typically consistent across platforms. And since eventually R6 Extraction would be removed off of Game Pass, this dip in stats might be even worse on other platforms. Knowing these statistics, you can clearly see that the game struggled with some problems. And since Ubisoft was banking on this game being another live service cash cow like Siege, things clearly weren't looking good for its future. And honestly, the game's player count never really recovered from this point. As of today, the game sits at a few hundred players on Steam, and its development has concluded due to the previous facts, meaning that no new content will be added moving forward, making this one of Ubisoft's shortest lived attempts at a live service game ever. If you read the Metacritic or Steam reviews on this game, they are incredibly mixed with a large variety of different complaints. A lot of complaints revolve around the same few issues though. That being that the game is awful in single player, the fact that the gameplay gets very repetitive very fast, and how the game should have been a mode for R6 and not a full-fledged $40 title. So to find out whether these reviews are true, exactly how the game got into this position here, and whether the game's worth players' time in 2025, I decided to buy the game when it was on sale and to put a lot of hours into the single player, multiplayer, and events to get a full-fledged and honest opinion. And in this video, I'll be bringing you my genuine opinion on all aspects of the game. I have a little over 20 hours in this game right now, which is more than a lot of other players in this game, so I feel I am educated enough on the topic to give my review. I'll be discussing the core gameplay mechanics, how the game plays in single player, the story of the game, the additional modes and events, the game's marketing, the monetization and pricing, and finally, I'll be wrapping up by discussing why I think the game failed. So strap in, because this is going to be a deep dive. Now, R6 Extraction's gameplay is a little contentious. Some people love it, and some people absolutely hate it. Similar to the Outbreak event in R6 a few years ago, the goal of this game is to progress through each map and 3 random objectives that change with each playthrough. These maps are broken up into 3 subzones that house one of those objectives. At any point, the player can choose to extract, leaving the game with their XP, or to advance to the next subzone. However, if they do either of those without completing the objective in that section, they will miss out on the XP from that subzone. This means that the player has to make a call based on their team's current resources and health on whether or not they should continue to advance or to cut their losses and extract. This is why the game is technically classified as an extraction shooter instead of an arcade shooter. Now, the reason the choice on whether or not to extract can be difficult at times is because if anyone on the team dies, that person will lose the operator they were playing, meaning they can't pick them in future matches. This can be a big deal, especially if you've only leveled up 1 or 2 operators, since you'll have to choose someone else who could potentially be under-leveled. However, the dead operator can be saved by playing another match on the same map and extracting the dead operator out of the match. If you and your team manage to extract with the fallen operator, they will be brought back into your roster, and they will begin healing to full HP over the course of the next few matches. Yes, that means that if your operator takes damage during a mission, they aren't healed to full HP at the end of the match. You have to wait for them to heal while you play other operators in the meantime. If you choose that operator without letting them heal, you will start the match off with the same amount of HP that you ended the previous match on. This mechanic is designed with the idea of encouraging players to play a wider range of operators instead of just choosing one operator and playing them the entire time they play the game. And this mechanic is quite effective in its goal. However, a lot of players have strong opinions on it. But many feel this mechanic forces the player to potentially play operators they don't want to or aren't interested in. And while I can agree with this sentiment, I still think this mechanic is an overall positive for the game as a whole. It adds a unique twist that doesn't exist in other games, and for me, it wasn't annoying once I got higher up in the levels. It can be frustrating when you first start out, but once you've progressed a decent amount and you have a few high-level operators, it just feels like a fair punishment for failing. And without this mechanic, there would be no real reason for extracting early, and the intensity of a match would be significantly altered. So I think forcing players to make tough calls in the middle of a match is healthy and makes you feel more engaged since there is always something on the line. Now, the operators themselves and the way they work is mostly the same as Rainbow Six Siege, all the way down to a lot of their weapons and even their gadgets. So if you've played Siege before, then you will likely get the hang of the operators pretty quickly. However, their gadgets are adjusted to fit a PvE environment, since they were obviously originally designed for a totally different game. For example, Alibi's Prismas will draw the attention of Archaens and will attack any that attack them. Tachanka gets his LMG back as his gadget to allow him to fill a defensive role, and Vigil's gadget hides him from being detected by Archaens. There are many more examples of gadgets being tweaked to fit the PvE playstyle, but if you understand how to play an operator in Siege, you will likely understand how to play them here, because for the most part, they still have the same gadgets that they did in Siege, they're just slightly tweaked, which is really good since most of your knowledge will carry over. But that comes with the downside of causing much of the gameplay to feel extremely stale for Siege players with high hour counts. Speaking of operators, the whole reason XP is important in this game is to level up your operator and to increase your development milestone. Operator levels unlock you new weapons, cosmetics, and passive stat boosts to your operators. Development milestones unlock new tech, more operators to your roster, access to more maps, and the ability to queue in limited time and more difficult modes. Basically, think of your development milestone as your overall account level and your operator level as your XP contribution with that specific operator. The progression in this game is just passable. My only complaint is that leveling up your operator can kind of feel unrewarding. Operators like Sophia already start off with great guns, so the only benefit you are getting from leveling her up is minor stat buffs and a slightly better gadget. I kind of wish that leveling up your character did more. I feel like just adding passive stat buffs is such a boring way to do operator progression. And I also think that since a lot of the operators share the same weapons, the weapon unlocks on operators feels kind of stale as well. But I will say that the development milestone leveling is pretty decent. Unlocking more react tech and operators as you progress is smart, but locking players into playing a small variety of maps when they first start out really isn't it. And that's the one main problem with the development milestone leveling in my opinion. It makes the first few hours of this game feel absolutely miserable, and it leads me to feeling like the overall progression system is designed to boost an artificial feeling of there being more content than the game actually has. Speaking of which, the difficulty system makes the early game feel even more miserable. Moderation and cautious are incredibly easy. You can basically waltz your way through every subzone once you understand the mechanics of the game. And the severe difficulty can be somewhat of a challenge depending on your level and the amount of players, but it's kind of like the medium difficulty of this game. So the only real challenge, at least in my opinion, is critical, which can be really fun, but you have to be a pretty high development milestone to be able to queue into open matchmaking on this difficulty. So this makes you want to level up as fast as possible to unlock it, or you'll be stuck playing an extremely easy and mind-numbing experience. Now that we have discussed everything related to operators and progression, I now want to talk about the different objectives in Extraction. There are currently 12 different objective types in the game. The first is an objective where you must rescue an MIA operator from the Archaean tree and carry them back to the extraction point. This objective can only be given to you if you or your teammate have an MIA operator in your roster, meaning that one of you died on this map in your previous matches. Rescuing the operator will provide you with XP like all the other objectives, but it will also revive that player's operator so that they can play them in future matches. This is the objective I discussed earlier when discussing the extraction mechanics, and it does its job. Then there is Rescue, which is literally just hostage from Siege ported over, where your entire goal is to get the hostage to the extraction zone. While carrying the hostage, their coughing will alert nearby enemies, and if the hostage dies, you will fail the objective. This objective feels more recycled than any other mode in the entire game, and you can definitely tell barely anything was changed to make it unique. Then after hostage rescue, another potential objective you can run into is triangulation. This is one of the easiest objectives in my eyes because what it requires for you to do is to activate 3 seismic stations within a short period of time. If you or your team is working together effectively, you can quite easily clear these objectives in literally seconds by ignoring the Archaens and just running to each station. I've done this solo as well, and it is generally the most effective way to deal with it. You might end up taking some damage, but that's better than clearing the entire map of Archaens. 2 more objectives that are somewhat similar are nest tracking and decontamination. Nest tracking requires the player to install trackers into nests, which are the little spores you see around the map that can spawn Archaens. But the nest must be dormant, meaning that an Archaen hasn't activated it. This can be a somewhat annoying objective depending on your map RNG, because if you get spotted and you have to destroy some nests, it is possible for you to run out of enough to actually complete the objective. But generally this isn't that bad, and you can complete it within 30 seconds or less as long as your team is on the same page and move stealthily. As for decontamination, it's another objective directly tied to nest. However, it is a specific new type of nest that you are tasked with dealing with. These objective-specific nest types are called abhorrent nests. They are green and rather obvious. All you have to do to complete the objective is to destroy all of these nests and then collect a sample from the malignant neoplasm in the center of the room. This objective is one of my favorites because it provides a genuine challenge. There are so many nests being compacted so tightly, and a lot of Archaeans typically guarding them, that it makes this objective turn your game into absolute chaos at the higher levels and difficulties. And when I say chaos, don't take that the wrong way. It's a fun kind of chaos. Now, the next objective I want to bring up is shutdown. This one tasks the players with taking out nutrient nodes using foam injectors. You get the injectors from the evac zone, and you have to carry them over to the nutrient node and plant them. This objective isn't difficult at all. All you have to worry about is clearing a path to and from the nutrient node, and then you can complete it rather easily. Another objective that requires you to use the extraction zone is specimen. This objective is pretty simple. What you and your team have to do is you must find the elite Archaean you are tasked with locating, and you must lure them over to the extraction zone, which houses a trap you can use to knock them unconscious with. You cannot let this Archaean die. If you do, you will fail the objective immediately. This is one of the easiest objectives because you don't have to put yourself at risk. The elite may draw other Archaeans towards you, and it will pretty much blow your cover guaranteed, but it really isn't super difficult because as long as you and your team are quick in leading it towards the extraction zone, you can pretty easily capture it and then run over to the next subzone. But this objective does tend to cause some confusion. I've seen lower level players kill the elite thinking that our objective was instead to kill it on multiple occasions, and it can get very annoying. Now, on the contrary, one of the harder objectives in the game is serial scan in my experience. This is a defensive objective where you have to activate a scanner and defend 3 different zones while waves of Archaeans fall onto your location. You can quickly get overwhelmed in these if you aren't ready, and it is one of my favorite objectives because of that fact. This is also one of the few objectives where the reinforcement mechanic is actually useful and worth taking advantage of, and it incentivizes creating an actual setup with your gadgets that will funnel the Archaeans into traps or other gadgets. Another objective that is quite similar to this is that of the sabotage objective. This is another defense objective, and to complete it, you and your team have to plant these explosives onto 2 arc spikes in the subzone. They're definitely not reused assets of closer charges in Siege. Once this is done, a timer will begin counting down, and you must defend these explosives from the waves of Archaeans until it detonates. I would guess that this mode was one of the first in development by Ubisoft, considering how similar it is to the bomb game mode from Rainbow Six Siege. The setup strategies are basically identical as well. You want to avoid reinforcing walls between the 2 spikes, and your team is going to want to separate to cover as much ground as possible. Even though it may clearly be inspired by its predecessor, I still think this is the best defensive objective in the game, and I think that it shows how good Ubisoft got at this sort of level design from their experience with Siege. Now, one of the most straightforward objectives in Extraction is Hunt. All you have to do to complete it is to hunt down the elite Archaean in the sector of the map and kill it. It's that simple. And this is the objective that causes a lot of confusion when Specimen is given to you, because it's very hard to tell the difference between this objective and Specimen unless you're reading the top left UI. Luckily though, this objective doesn't require much teamwork, and the biggest challenge in completing it is really just where you find the elite and what kind of elite it is. After that, it's a cakewalk. Another objective that is very similar to this is biopsy. This requires you or your team to find the location of specific Archaeans and perform a takedown on them. This sort of implies the need for stealth, maybe similar to the nest tracking mission I mentioned earlier. Well, that is far from reality, because with a well-placed stun grenade, you can just walk up behind the enemy and perform a takedown, whether they spotted you or not. This is something that I didn't understand in my first few playthroughs, and I originally thought that once you were spotted, you would have to hide and wait for them to forget about you so that way you could make another attempt. But once I figured out that stuns could easily complete this objective for you, it became rather trivial, and I never had any difficulty with it again. This is a real problem with the game's balancing as a whole, because you can pretty much easily kill any Archaen you want with a well-placed stun grenade, and it's something that affects the game from the ground up in every mode. Anyways, the final objective isn't so easy though. Gateway is an objective where you and your team have to fight a boss. This boss fight is the same every time, so there isn't much variety in this mission, but it still can get pretty difficult, which I like. My main issue with this objective revolves around the instability. I had a lot of problems with this fight inducing crashes on my system, which I don't know if others have been able to replicate, but it has been a huge problem for me. One time, me and my team loaded into the objective and I got stuck in an endless crash loop that made me get off for the night. This isn't really a feature, but I still think it was worth mentioning considering how big of a problem it is. And the other reason why I don't like this objective is because of its repetitiveness. Once you do this a few times, it becomes monotonous, especially since it's the same fight every single time without any variety. And the arena that you're fighting the boss on also just so happens to be the same as well. So I try to avoid this objective if I can, but sometimes you're just forced to play it, and typically it won't be a fun time. Anyway, since I have covered all of the objectives in the game now, I also want to mention the Archaens themselves, since they are arguably the most important part of the game, and they are what hold up the entire rest of the gameplay. Currently, there are 10 different variants of Archaens in Extraction, and considering that the game's development has been permanently halted, I doubt we will ever see anything new on this front. The first of these is obviously the Grunt. These are the most common types of Archaens you will encounter in your game time, and they are the simplest to deal with as well. Their weak point is in their head, meaning that you can take them out with a suppressed weapon before they even notice you. And if you miss, they don't require much damage to take out either. A few well-placed shots to the body can take them down as well if absolutely necessary. They're mainly meant to act as the zombie or cannon fodder of this game, and they do their job well. Now, another Archaen very similar to the Grunt is the Spiker. These guys differ from the Grunts by attacking from a distance and using a massive spike on their arm to protect their head while doing so. You can still kill them with one shot to the head, but this will be more difficult due to their defense mechanism. Overall, these guys can be pretty annoying in combination with other big enemy types, but on their own, they can be dealt with easily without much effort. Now, the next two Archaens look very similar and can be mistaken for one another, those being the Breacher and the Bloater. Breachers are crawling enemies that have a large red sack on their back as their weak point. Upon being shot, they will explode immediately. However, the reason they are called breachers is because of their ability to open walls. Breachers, especially on defense objectives, will breach walls on purpose to put holes in your defenses, making it easier for their fellow Archaeans to push you. These guys can be pretty hard to deal with due to their ability to deal lots of damage quickly and to open walls, but generally you can deal with them without much of a problem when they are on their own. As I mentioned, bloaters look very similar to a breacher, and they can kind of function similarly. However, the sack on their back is green instead of red, and upon being shot, they will release toxic gas into the air instead of exploding. This can make them quite lethal since they can force you into corners, lower your visibility, hamper your movement, and weaken you so another Archaen can finish the job. In my experience, these guys are far more lethal than their breacher counterparts, and they have been a lot more of a nuisance in my playthroughs, but they are still rather easy to dispatch if they are on their own without the defense of another more powerful Archaen to draw the attention. Speaking of stronger Archaeans, the next one I wanted to discuss is the Rooter. These are the tall Archaeans with spiked legs that have a lot of bulletproof armor on their body. Their main weak point is on their back, but stunning them and performing a takedown is probably the most effective way to get rid of them. Due to their ability to take a lot of damage and to dispense a lot of damage in your direction, they tend to be the perfect distraction for other Archaeans like the Breacher or Bloater to get the jump on you. But these guys are by no means the most difficult Archaen to deal with, and there will be more pesky ones to come. The most notable example of one of these more difficult Archaeans is the Smasher. These guys are basically hunters from Halo, except they have no ranged attacks. The only way Smashers can take damage is via the weak point on their back, or a takedown due to how much heavy armor covers their body. This makes them the best tank in the game, and they can be a real difficulty when surrounded by groups of other Archaeans. Additionally, when they charge at you, if they make a successful hit, a ton of damage will be dealt to you, which can really punish you if you aren't paying attention. I also just think that these guys are the coolest looking and by far have the best design, which is why they were likely so iconic in both the Siege event Archaen and in Extraction. Similar to the Smasher, the Sower also has armor covering most of its body, but unlike the Smasher, the Sower is a crawling Archaen. This enables it to hide in a horde effectively, and since the Sower's weak point is on its belly, it can be quite difficult to kill them with bullets. What can make Sowers especially annoying is the fact that their main defense mechanism is placing mines around themselves. These mines can easily catch you off guard, and if set off, they can open you up to taking heavy damage from other hostiles. Another rather difficult crawling Archaen is the Lurker. Their weak point is on their head, but the armor around their head will close once attacked, so just headshotting them isn't so simple. And it still takes a lot of damage to dispatch them via a headshot. It's normally smarter, at least in my experience, to either mag dump them or to perform a takedown rather than trying to wait for a weak point to open up on them. Another Archaen that can rival the Smasher in difficulty is the Tormentor. These guys are fast moving, hard to shoot, and they have a large health pool. Due to this, they can be very difficult to eliminate quickly, and since their weak point is on their head, taking them down can be a challenging endeavor. Now, the last Archaen, the Apex, is very similar to the Tormentor in its appearance. However, its gameplay functionally is vastly different. Firstly, and most importantly, the Apex can spawn other Archaeans around it as a defense mechanism. This combined with the Apex's ability to move quickly and shoot players, and the fact that it only has a weak point on the back of its head, makes the Apex arguably the strongest Archaen in the game. Luckily, just by prioritizing its death by mag dumping him every time he gets close enough can dispatch him, but he can still get your team killed if you don't focus on taking him down ASAP. Anyways, this is pretty much everything we have to discuss when it comes to the core gameplay. Now I want to take these mechanics and discuss them in the context of single player. Now, I know what most people are going to say when I mention single player in the context of this game. People will say, this is a co-op shooter, not a single player experience. And I agree with you. But considering that the game advertises itself on Steam and likely other platforms as having a single player component, I want to address its problems. Especially since in my experience trying to queue into multiplayer at lower ranks is basically impossible in the modern day with a low player count. I'll make for sure to keep it brief though. Now, when I first booted up the game to get the experience for making this video, I tried to play multiplayer, but every time I loaded into a game, the other players would leave due to my low level. This may not be replicatable for others, but I still figured it was worth mentioning so that you can understand what brought me to the single player. So I loaded into single player and started playing with one of my favorite operators from Siege, Ella, and I didn't really know what to expect. I went into this game completely blind. I'd played Outbreak before, but Extraction I had never touched or really ever seen gameplay of, so I expected it to be kind of difficult. Well, in the earlier levels, even in single player, that wasn't the case at all. These lower difficulties had very few enemies, and there weren't many special Archaeans either. So stealthing through these missions and completing the objectives was a cakewalk, and very boring from a gameplay perspective. However, once the difficulty ramped up, things shifted quickly and the game became very challenging for a solo player. Lots of difficult Archaean mutations, and the objectives quickly became a lot more difficult to complete with all the Archaeans. This is because you have way less resources at your disposal, since you don't have 3 operator gadgets on your team, and your secondary gadget count is significantly less as well. This makes the lack of man count issues even worse than they would already be. And since the game doesn't really throw you any bones to make up for the fact that you're alone in single player, really isn't a good experience. Single player should be avoided as much as possible in my eyes. And once you climb up the game's progression system and become a high enough level to play in open lobbies without being kicked, play it, because it's a way better experience than single player ever was. I understand this game is meant to be played from a co-op environment, and I can definitely see why now, because the game single player absolutely sucks. Now, before you say it, I understand what kind of game this is. Story isn't the most important thing when talking about games in this genre, and in my experience, the story isn't the thing that most people care about, including myself. So I'll try to keep it brief, and I won't go too much into detail, but I still felt it would be worth talking about in this video, so I'm trying to cover every aspect of this game in some level of detail. And the lore, whether you like it or not, is something that Ubisoft put a decent amount of effort into. The lore of R6 Extraction obviously starts with Operation Outbreak. In this operation, multiple meteorites that had crashed around the world in a variety of areas and a Russian space shuttle was discovered to be infected by a prehistoric parasite that outdated the universe. This parasite was called Chimera, and the location where the Russian spacecraft crashed is what we saw in the Outbreak event for Siege. This crash location was in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and a man named Boyd Brooks witnessed the crash, took the capsule, and hid it in his garage. But when he opened it, he became infected and began spreading the parasite until it eventually spread across the entire town. Eventually, Team Rainbow, along with government officials, would manage to contain the parasite and successfully quarantine the town. While it was being quarantined, the parasite was learning from the environment and learning how to deal with humans. During this time, the parasite would manage to evolve to better fight back against humans, and it would learn how to operate without a human host. So the parasite was able to produce Archaens to protect itself, and it would manage to break free. This is when the parasite started fulfilling its goal of infecting the entire planet, and due to the parasite re-emerging as a bigger threat, React, a subdivision of Team Rainbow, was created to combat that impending threat. Eventually, the parasite would manage to spread all the way from a research facility in Alaska and Truth or Consequences to New York and even San Francisco. This is where Rainbow Six Extraction picks up. You as the player are playing as operators assigned to the React team, and your goal is to research the parasite to better understand how it works and how it mutates, and you obviously must assist in containing and fighting back against it. Throughout the game, you'll get little bits and pieces of lore via different cutscenes with the different operators, studies, and secrets around the map. But this is the basic gist of the story in a shorter format for the sake of brevity. It's nothing crazy, but it gets the job done. My biggest problem with this story is that it kind of just lumps you in and you feel like you have no idea, especially at the start. You feel pretty much completely lost in the story, and there are very few cutscenes with operators. After the first few levels of the game, and after you've played through the game for maybe 3 hours or so, the game stops giving you cutscenes to learn about lore, and instead you have to read through the studies and logs, which no one really wants to do that in a PvE game. So it makes the story just feel like a side component that doesn't really matter. So if you're expecting the story to be a huge focus of the game or to be anything more than passable, you'll be woefully disappointed. Anyways, now that we have discussed everything involved with the core game, I now want to discuss the additional modes and events that are available in Extraction that are unrelated to the base story or progression. If we were to go through every single one of these modes, I would be here for a while, because just like with Siege, Ubisoft did seasonal events for Extraction that add unique mechanics and gameplay as a form of content. I never was able to play any of these since I only played the game recently to get this footage, so I will be avoiding discussing most of these modes since I lack experience with them. However, there are still 2 playlists available in the game at the time of writing. These include Assignments and Maelstrom Protocol. Assignments is a playlist filled with additional game modes that change the way the core game is played. Some examples of this include Wall to Wall, which requires the player to unlock each airlock at a security station instead of being able to progress like normal. Also, the longer you spend in the mission, the stronger the Archaens become, meaning that you must take on each mission at a faster pace. Then another mode present is Veteran Mode, which enables friendly fire, minimizes the amount of HUD elements, and it enables tactical reloading, which basically means when you reload with ammo in your magazine, that ammo will be lost. This results in a much more tactical feel than what you will experience in the normal base game. But at the end of the day, these modes and the others present in the assignment playlist all suffer from the same problem, and that is they really don't change much. Minor changes like tactical reload or an extra step in the airlock process isn't enough to motivate me to play this mode over the base game, and it appears that that is the case for the rest of the community, because the queue times for these assignments is insanely long, and these game modes are pretty much dead at this point. Now for the other playlist, Maelstrom Protocol, this playlist functions as a makeshift ranked playlist for Extraction. The way it works is that you can queue with your friends or an open queue, and then your and your team's goal is to get as much XP as possible by completing as many subzones as you can. The more XP you get, the higher class or rank you reach, which will unlock you unique rewards for each rank. This may seem simple enough, but Maelstrom Protocol is by far the most difficult way to experience Extraction. First of all, there are 9 subzones instead of the usual 3. This is to allow the player to hit that 90k experience required to achieve the maximum rank. But they didn't just stop there. There's also a timer that forces players to complete objectives in a certain amount of time, and as players progress through each subzone, they are given less and less time to complete the objectives within. To go along with this, the difficulty of the Archaens also increases with each subzone, making the game get increasingly harder as you stay in the lobby longer and longer. This can make it actually quite hard to achieve the higher ranks in Maelstrom, especially if you solo queue and if you don't have much experience with playing Extraction. This mode requires good teamwork and resource management, especially the latter half, which is what makes this mode so unique, and it's definitely a solid playlist for a more difficult and competitive experience. I'm just surprised to see a mode like this even in the game at all, because most PvE games will try to take a super competitive approach. But I guess Ubisoft decided to experiment here, and I personally think it works. Speaking of the competitive experience, I think it's now time to discuss the game's marketing, and I think this was one of the worst parts about Extraction. This game's marketing was horribly mismanaged. Firstly, the initial trailers for the game back when it was being named R6 Quarantine made it seem like the game was going to be a tactical and gritty experience, and kind of reminded me of the trailers that were released to advertise Call of Duty World War II Zombies mode. There was a huge emphasis on horror, and it really seemed like this game was going to be a unique experience. You could see operators from Rainbow Six Siege in the trailer, but it at least looked unique enough to be its own game. However, after the game's awful rebranding, more trailers began to come out leading up to the game's release, and the shift in tone was quite drastic, along with the fact that it was much more obvious how much was being reused from its predecessor. In both the gameplay and cinematic trailers for Extraction, we all got to see the operators were the same, the abilities were the same, and the enemies were just a visual downgrade from the original. These are all of the reasons why the game's trailers had mediocre like to dislike ratios, and the reception was middling at best. The game's constant rebranding and delays also didn't help, because a lot of that advertising revenue that they spent on their initial trailers likely went to waste, since a lot of people wouldn't have noticed the rebrand. What also didn't help the game's marketing was Ubisoft's huge emphasis on advertising it to the Siege fan base. Leading up to the weeks before release, Ubisoft started sponsoring Siege creators to make content on the game early. They even went as far as to host a competitive tournament with a $75,000 prize pool for some of these creators to compete against each other. The big names from the scene like Shock, A21 Mayo, Yo Boy Roy, Autumn May, Skittles, and Uzi participated, just to name a few. This was a big ordeal with live casting and everything, and I doubt it was cheap. The issue with this is that it sent the totally wrong message to players. Advertising your casual arcade extraction zombie shooter by hosting a comp tournament with creators from a comp shooter game isn't the move. I understand that R6 Extraction is a spinoff of Rainbow Six Siege, and Ubisoft likely wanted that large player base to bleed over, but convincing these players to play Extraction was going to be a steep task, not to mention getting them to stick around long enough to keep its live service elements alive. These players had already experienced the original event for absolutely free, so a lot of them were never going to budge on paying for the title, and even if they did, Ubisoft decided to market the game under a competitive lens to a lot of these people, which is obviously not what they should have focused on, in my opinion, in the marketing, since R6 Extraction shines as a more casual experience. But whether or not this marketing had a huge effect on the game's performance overall is unknown, and I doubt we ever will know. I just think it's a good thing to assume that, considering that the game performed so poorly on launch. Another thing that didn't help the game's performance was its monetization. A common complaint you'll see in comment sections and in reviews is that the game isn't worth it at full price. Just wait for a sale or get it on Game Pass. This sentiment is mainly held due to Ubisoft's decision to make the game $40, and with the issue of the game mostly being recycled content, as we have discussed earlier, many people felt there wasn't enough new content to justify that cost. Many even went as far as to say that the game should have been an addition to Siege and not a new title. However, the monetization doesn't stop there. The game also came equipped with an in-game cosmetics shop, similar to many other titles. This was perceived poorly by some people, but surprisingly most people didn't care about this at all, and it was actually received quite well. And that's because the cosmetics in Extraction are absolutely amazing. Ubisoft really knocked it out of the park here, and for the price, I actually don't think these cosmetics are a terrible deal. So this is actually a rare example of a AAA game not being ruined by its microtransactions, especially since you can technically get them for free. There isn't anything pay to win about them, the skins are actually good, and their pricing isn't terrible. The only issue with the game's monetization is the base game launch price. $40 is way too much for the amount of content available. They probably should have at the very least released the game for half of this price. But even with that discounted price, I still think it would have been a hard sell for those Siege players who had played the original event, since a lot of them felt like they had already experienced the game for free. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what are my overall thoughts on the game? Is the game worth buying 2 years later after launch, and why did it fail commercially? Well, the main issues that resulted in the game's downfall was the disastrous marketing, the lack of new and unique content compared to Siege, and the astronomical asking price. I do see a lot of positive comments and reviews for the game, but a combination of these three issues seems to stop most players from playing the game. I think that if Extraction was given to Siege players for free, or if it was built into the game as a side mode, the game would have been a lot more successful financially, especially if they decided to synchronize progression across the two games or allowed cosmetics to transfer. Also, if the game had managed to create successful marketing that got the game's vision across while making a clear distinction between it and Siege earlier, then more people likely would have been interested. I think the marketing team horribly failed at this, and I think the executive decisions to make this a separate game for $40 was the final nail in the coffin. Now, what are my thoughts on the game as a whole? Is the game even remotely worth picking up in 2025? Well, the biggest issue with the game now is just that it is officially at the end of its life stage, meaning that they are no longer updating or supporting the game. This means there are few players online and the queues are extremely long. especially since it's been moved off Game Pass. So at a minimum, you'd want to buy the game with 2 other friends to ensure you actually get a decent experience, because as I've made very clear, the single player should be avoided at all costs. Another thing that makes it hard to justify is the boring and slow early game grind. Extraction is extremely boring in the beginning before you unlock the harder difficulties and before you level up any of your characters. It's not difficult at all, and you can just waltz your way through nearly any mission without even thinking. This is the biggest problem with the game to me, and it almost led to me just scrapping this video altogether. For my first 10 hours or so, I was absolutely miserable, especially since I was having to play the game solo, and you'd likely end up having a similar experience to me if you bought it today without getting your friends involved. Then my final issue with the game was the feeling of little content present. From someone who has put close to 5,000 hours into Rainbow Six Siege across all platforms, this game feels like a side mode to it. There is very little new content that makes this game stand out, which is one of the leading reasons why it failed to capture a target audience, since most Siege players had already experienced a lot of the content in Extraction. No new Extraction exclusive operators, no newer unique gadgets on existing operators, and a lot of the enemy types present were in the Outbreak event for Siege. If they had added some form of content in that regard, the game likely would have been a lot better, since players wouldn't have felt as ripped off. But I just think Ubisoft was too scared to do so, since it was so heavily attached to Siege and its lore and advertising. Overall, I would likely recommend you steering clear of this game. The only way it would even be worth your time is if you can pick it up while it's on sale for 20 bucks. But even then, there is a high likelihood you will end up being disappointed with the amount of content in the game. And it saddens me to say that, because I know what this game could have been if it was managed properly, if it didn't go through development hell, and if it was marketed appropriately, which is the same sentiment that many fans of the game still hold today. Some developers at Ubisoft worked really hard on this, and I remember after the initial trailers for the game, me and my friends were extremely excited for a horror extraction shooter in the Siege universe. But that hype very quickly turned into disappointment as time went on, and we discovered that the game was basically just an attempt at making more money off the original event they had made back in 2018. I genuinely don't know what Ubisoft was doing over the game's long 4-year development cycle, because there really isn't any significant content to show for it, and I can't imagine how poorly this game would have been received if it wasn't delayed all that time ago. Maybe in another life this game would have been a successful side mode for Rainbow Six Siege that boosted sales to the original and that drew a new audience to the series. But in this one, this game is an utter failure, and one of Ubisoft's biggest losses in history. And 3 years later, the game is still just as bad.